Jazz comes from Africa, don't you know? Well, of course we know. And how do we know? We've been told so. They told us. They told us in kindergarten and in first grade and in second grade. And they kept telling us until it became truth. Of course, jazz comes from Africa. Don't you know that Bösendorfers and Stradivarius and Kilwerts and Selmers and Ludwig and Tamar all made in Africa? It comes from Africa. Africa has a rich culture, and in ancient times there was a Nubian kingdom that was more advanced and more intelligent and more resilient and more powerful and more kind and good-hearted than any and all cultures that came before it or after it. There is absolutely zero archaeological findings to support this, but that's because they were so smart that they cleaned up after themselves. I mean, before themselves, before they went extinct. I mean, before the evil white men came over to Africa to exterminate them and steal jazz from them, from Africa. I mean, don't you know that Dave Brubeck was African, and Gershwin was African, and Benny Goodman was African, and Gene Krupa was African, right? So sometimes there is an aura around something that we accept that jazz comes from all kinds of African rhythms and African ideas, and of course that's all a big crock of number two with beans. But that's one of those cliches or truth that we've been conditioned to accept unconditionally, and of course challenging that in this day and age would be tantamount to racism. Because if you say that you are robbing someone of something, you're culturally appropriating something. It's interesting that I haven't yet heard this in conjunction with jazz. I guess that because most of the people who like repeating these kinds of things are themselves jazz fans, or at least present themselves as because obviously they're not going to listen to rock and roll music. That's ew. And of course, today rock and roll represents whiteness. How stupid it's rooted in blues, right? And of course, they're not going to listen to RAP because they consider themselves too high up to listen to that. So they listen to jazz, and they know big names like John Coltrane and Herbie Hancock and Miles Davis, and they talk among themselves. They know what the hell they're talking about. But they all know that jazz came from Africa, and of course, they don't call people who listen to jazz being culturally appropriating, because they would be accusing themselves. So of course they have to accuse everybody else of racism but themselves. So in a nutshell, that's technically the video could end here, because that's all it is. It's an obvious fabrication. Now, of course, it is true that a lot of people with black skin, Americans with black skin, were involved in the very early jazz scene. But some people with white skin were also very much involved with it. But it's sort of developed into representing somehow something that's culturally black, or a kind of culture that a lot of people, a lot of black people are heavily involved. So that's definitely true. There were a lot of cafes and bars and places that were jazz clubs that were predominantly performed by black people and attended by black people. But that has nothing to do with the origins of jazz. The origins of jazz are of course classical music that started to become being blended with folk elements. And when I say folk, I mean it in the broadest meaning imaginable. So folk means what you would call today world music. So the local music of many places, and of course a lot of experimenting with all kinds of rhythms that are not rooted in classical music, percussion instrument. The drum became very prominent in jazz. In early jazz, it wasn't so much. If you listen to what I term boring jazz, that's one word, boring jazz. Early Satchmo, meaning Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie and Django Reinhardt, whom I hate. I'm sorry, I can't stand him. I don't like that style at all. Even Miles Davis, pre 70s, I don't really listen to Miles Davis. People can scream and repeat "kind of blue" until they're kind of blue in the face, but no. To me, Miles Davis became the real Miles Davis when he started working with Marcus Miller, and maybe more importantly with John McLaughlin. And I think they started in 60, 69, maybe 68 or 70. Bitches Brew was one of the first records when he started really going into the bebop and become more progressive and become more fusiony and beboppy and poppy and experiment. That's when really he went through the roof. Funny story, by the way, while we're already speaking about this nonsense. Uh, Miles was known to be pretty racist against white people, obviously. And in the period when he was working with McLaughlin, which is roughly, like I said, 70, give or take a year to about a 4 year period or so, maybe a little bit longer. And some of his friends told him, "Hey, if you hate white people, why do you making music with a white guitar player?" So he says, "Okay, bring me a black guy who can play like him. I'll take him." But I mean, there weren't really shortage of black people who could play the guitar, but McLaughlin was really is still a very unique player, very fluid and very adaptive. But anyway, that's really the short and the long of this debunking this cliche. I mean, it's not even really worth digging into it because there was nothing in Africa. There was barely the minimal, the most primitive agriculture and the farming. So they barely had cattle there, and there were barely developed languages. Even certainly not an intricate and developed music style like jazz. Not even the primitive aspects or components of jazz. Maybe a little bit of the rhythms were influenced by Africa. I'm definitely willing to consider that, just as they were from all over the world, from South America to Eastern Europe to you name it. So jazz, from its inception or almost from its inception, went on that paradigm or that idea to incorporate all kinds of whatever it hears, whatever is available. And of course, there is a very strong South American component, which in and of itself has to be Europe influenced. It's not necessarily native. It's very Spanish influence. It's very Spain. So all the rumba and the samba that found themselves their way into jazz are quite heavily, or at least in some degree, rooted in traditional Spanish folk music, not what today you would call flamenco. That's not exactly accurate, but Spanish folk music, let's just say. So rumba and samba, even though they developed and moved away from the original aspects of the music, but they are rooted in that. So, is there some native contribution from the area? Possibly, probably. I don't know. Not familiar with American Indian culture or Native American from South America. Maybe they did have those cultures were definitely more developed. So there are archaeological findings. There are pyramids in South America and remnants of old and pretty big and pretty developed civilizations. So there it's very easy to surmise or to suppose that they had music. Was it as developed as European classical music? God only knows. I don't know. I don't think so. But again, without really checking, without really looking to it, we shouldn't jump onto conclusion. But there's definitely no music to speak about in terms of a ready to consume, ready made, fully developed music coming from Africa. Nah, that never happened. Even today, when they do have technology, it's very basic, very simple, very tribal, barely developed instruments. It's mostly percussion. It's mostly sticks being beaten together, or stick being beaten on a hollow trunk. Things of that nature. Maybe some smaller African cultures did develop to have their own music in terms that we understand music today, but to say that jazz originated in that, or that was what created jazz is absolutely false. It's not true. Jazz came from classically trained musicians who went on to local folk music and incorporated other elements, and that's what it is. And it's if anything more than anything else, as a openly or strictly cultural phenomenon, more than anything else, jazz symbolizes the United States of America. Incidentally, the flow and the amalgamation of many people and many cultures and many traditions. Yes, if you want to think of something that truly symbolizes what the starry eyes, what would be the right word to say here, the archetypal, the stereotypical, let's just say, or the ideal of America as it's presented in storybooks, that everything is good and nice and the brotherly love and all of that, and the melting pot of all the cultures. That's jazz more than anything else. It's not rock, it's not blues, it's not hamburgers, it's not hot dogs, it's not Coca-Cola, it's not cheap stinking American beer. It's jazz more than anything else. Yes, that ironically that is true. And not to say that there isn't European jazz, but the direction is strictly USA to Europe, as far as jazz itself goes. And yes, I know the Django was in France, but he was influenced by American players. So no, jazz was not born in Africa. Jazz was not brought here from Africa. African people didn't invent or bring jazz. I'm sure that there are a bunch of people who are of African origin who were even born in Africa and became jazz players. Yeah, of course, that definitely could be. But it doesn't mean that they brought jazz with them from Africa. Jazz was born here, yes, via the involvement of heavily influenced by people who are black and who grew up in black areas and black neighborhoods. So yes, definitely there is an influence, but that's American black. It's not African black. Those people were here for generations already. They forgot their African heritage, if they ever had one. And no, there is no music that's outright developed or born in Africa. Like I said, there probably are some local tiny little fragments or fragments of cultures that have some music, but not as a collective, not as African, not something outright that was born and developed and made in Africa. No, jazz was born here, and it was made with a lot of black people, maybe heavily influenced or started by mostly black musicians, but there were many other musicians from all over the world, South America, Europe, you name it. Like I told you, that there are tons and tons of Asian great jazz players. Yes, they came in a little bit later, but there were already at the turn of the century, there were Japanese and Chinese people and people from Asia, from the Far East, right? That typical, stereotypical Japanese curiosity is more a post-World War II phenomenon. Not to say that it didn't exist before, but to my knowledge, there aren't very many, maybe very few single individuals who are notorious, or maybe even less notorious, but jazz musicians who are Japanese or of Japanese origin very early on. Yeah, post war for sure, yes, but not that I know of, not before the war. So that's another stupid cliche that people just repeat mindlessly and believe it. But no, jazz didn't come from Africa. Maybe Africa came from jazz. Who knows? The modern ideal. But no, jazz was born and bred here in the United States, and it spread all over the world. And yes, it might have an African component in it, but it does not come from Africa. Just like the trumpet and the saxophones and the Stradivarius and the Bösendorfers don't come from Africa. So doesn't jazz. That's all I wanted to tell you today. So rock on and on and on and on.